The noise rolled through the town, slipping into every window, seeping under shutters, and creeping past doors. A sharp whistle, the clamor of voices, the neighing of horses, and a shriek teetering on the edge of audibility sent chills down spines. But not for the people. Leo set aside the half-finished spear meant for a bear and stretched until his joints cracked, letting the noise swell and the discontent of his packmates simmer. Outside, the entire town had gathered, encircling a group of loud strangers. The newcomers, caught up in the thrill of their hunt, didn't seem to notice the rakes and hoes clutched in work-worn hands. Or perhaps they didn't see them as a threat. These brash young men who thought death could only come from a sword. The creature that had screamed once now thrashed weakly in the hunter's net, exhausted and desperate. Its soft hissing sounded like the rustle of autumn leaves. Wings were slowly shrinking into arms, its face nearly human, and tattered clothing hung in shreds, barely covering its shame. "Hey, mutts, give us a hand tying it up and we'll pay you," said the bravest of the group, pulling on the reins of his horse so hard that blood flowed from his mouth. "Of course," Leo replied, his grin sharp and wolfish. A canine smile stretched wide as he nodded toward the others. The creature froze beneath the net, watching as the werewolves deftly pulled the hunters to the ground and snapped their necks, both men and horses. The latter didn't like wolves anyway, and leaving them alive wasn't an option. A horse was too noticeable a beast. Meanwhile, the alpha approached the now female creature, lifting her gently but firmly as he freed her from the net. He tilted her head back, inspecting her like property. Her upper lip quivered under his hand, revealing retractable, needle-like fangs. Vampire's fangs. Long, thin, and venomous like a snake's. A pureblood, then. Rare these days. Worth a fortune as a commodity or an ally, depending on her behavior. "We won't turn you in," Leo stated calmly, lifting the vampire into his arms. Her body was light and cold, as though she were scarcely alive. He scanned the faces of his pack. They were busy, carving up the bounty of fresh meat. His gaze locked onto a she-wolf. "Grace, do you have some spare clothes?" he asked. "When I'm done here, I'll send a cub with something," she replied dismissively, elbow deep in a horse's entrails, pulling them into a basin. The vampire weakly struggled as he spoke, but Leo only tightened his hold, still gentle for now. "Quiet, fool. It'll be easier for you to hide here," he muttered, carrying her into his cabin. He set her down on the stove bed, and she immediately curled into the darkest corner, her crimson eyes glinting from the shadows. Leo pulled an old blanket from a chest. "Cover yourself until they bring you something proper to wear." "What's your name?" he asked. "Annabelle," she answered softly, clutching the blanket around her. "Of course it is," Leo thought bitterly. "They've nearly been wiped out, and yet they give their last offspring names fit for bloodsuckers." He spat in annoyance. "Listen closely if you don't want more hunters coming after your hide," he said, his tone firm. "When you're around humans, keep your eyes down and your mouth shut. And remember this under pain of death. Your name is now Quiet. But a wolf can't be named Annabelle. If you want to survive, you'll pretend to be one of us. Humans will never leave you in peace, and not every pack would dare shelter you. As for your kind, they probably don't even have the strength to protect themselves anymore. The steward will come looking for his hunters tomorrow, maybe the day after. I'll handle him. But if you don't listen to me, I can't promise you won't end up on his table in a potion, or..." He rotated his wrist meaningfully. "Just do as I say. Understand?" The vampire nodded, more a fledgling than anything else despite her mature appearance. She listened to authority, to confidence. That suited Leo just fine. He stepped outside, Bloodstains had already been covered with fresh sand and gravel. Fires flickered to life in the homes, meat stewing in their iron pots. If the steward came, he wouldn't find so much as a thread or bone. Leo surveyed his town with satisfaction. Here came Grace's cub, darting toward him with a bundle of clothing in hand. The steward arrived in person to search for his hunters, speaking to Leo with arrogance, never dismounting his skittish warhorse. He wrinkled his nose at the scent of wolf. If he could, he'd have hanged them all, but good workers were scarce. Strong, tireless laborers were too valuable after the vampire wars decimated the population. Tolerating werewolves was a bitter necessity. Neither fully allies nor entirely enemies, they were an uneasy compromise. As the steward interrogated Leo, his men poked into every corner, even climbing to Grace's attic, where the vampire lay pretending to be ill. Pale beneath matted, greasy hair, she coughed from the dust, reeking of rotting meat buried in sawdust. The stench and her frail appearance turned the soldiers away. They barely glanced at her before covering their noses and moving on. They didn't look in the barrels or the garbage heaps either, not wolves after all. "Leo, I need workers for my estate," the steward said as he prepared to leave. "Send me 3 strong males, from your pack or the neighboring villages. I don't care." Leo's smile was cold. Workers, was it? Likely for some bloody wolf fights at a banquet. But refusal wasn't an option. He had to nod meekly and calculate which of his packmates he could afford to send to their probable deaths. "Quiet, go wash up. You don't have to hide anymore." "They won't return any time soon," Leo said, climbing into the attic. "Afterward, help Grace. There's plenty of work to do. We'll talk tonight." The Alpha walked through the town, calming his people, urging them back to their tasks. If anyone panicked now, it would end poorly for everyone. They needed to see his composure. He found a pair of adolescents and sent them to neighboring villages with messages. Then, slowly, he left the town. The forest path twisted and turned. One barely visible fork led through thick underbrush to the floor of a ravine, ending at a narrow crevice. He had to turn sideways to pass through, brushing against the walls before emerging into a small cave. On the far wall were niches carved into the stone, holding skulls surrounded by piles of bones. Leo lit candles beside the largest skull, its yellowed fangs gleaming. These were his grandfather's remains. Walter slammed his fist on the table, his voice a growl of frustration. "To bow our backs for the governor. Do you think we deserve this? Is this what we fought for? To trade one yoke for another?" The old wolf's bones ached from the impact. If only he were younger, but time moved only forward. "Quiet," hissed Loyal, his son, with a sharp glance toward the small room. "You'll wake the boy. We have no choice. No warriors, no weapons, no supplies. We have land now, houses, forest. We can survive. Martin?" "That's not my name anymore," the young werewolf reminded him curtly. "Names are a luxury we can't afford. Remember that. And don't anger the humans." "Ah, right. We're stuck with nicknames now, like dogs." The old man rose, leaning on his hands to keep them from trembling. "We were once chained by vampires. Now we're beasts of burden for humans. But we're alive," Martin muttered, glancing toward the hearth where his wife and their only surviving cub, their son, slept peacefully. "And we have a roof over our heads, food, warmth. How long would you last out there now?" "Grandpa, did you really fight with a scythe?" "Leo," the boy asked one day while sitting by Walter's side. His parents had gone to the communal fields, leaving the cub under the old wolf's watchful eye. "Of course, Leo," Walter said, deliberately using the boy's full family name rather than calling him Wolf. It felt more fitting. Like death itself, I wielded a scythe and sliced through enemies, taking their souls. Their souls. The boy's eyes widened with childlike wonder, his innocent belief embracing the tale. Of course. How else do you think I bargained with the Reaper? I gave him their souls in exchange for mine, Walter replied with a wry smile, inspecting the gleam of the scythe blade in the dim light. Leo fell silent, lost in thought. Walter waited patiently, savoring the moments when the boy's untainted mind revealed insights untouched by the cynicism of adults. We're wolves, right? Not like humans. We can turn into wolves and run in our pelts. We're strong, healthier than them. The boy's curious gaze locked onto the old werewolf. That's right, Walter confirmed, leaning the sharpened scythe against the wall beside the bench. Then why do we live like this? Why can't we hunt freely? Our part of the forest is small, and there's little game. We have to toil for the humans, and we live poorer than they do. Walter blinked in surprise. So this is what the boy had been pondering since his trip to the governor's estate with his father. A sharp mind for one so young, though the thought could have come from something he overheard. Certainly not from his father. Don't mention this to your father, Walter said after a pause, stroking Leo's head with a mix of pride and melancholy. He'll say we're all rebuilding the world after the war, but in truth we've just traded masters. This wolf is hereby sentenced to death by hanging, the herald declared from the platform. We'll live, just not today, Walter whispered to Leo, holding his grandson's gaze as the noose tightened around his neck. The candles extinguished in a sudden gust. Smoke curled around the old wolf's head. The new moon cast the forest into darkness. The stars offered only the faintest light. A small fire flickered amidst the dense shadows, a beacon of warmth in the cold, oppressive night. Leo stood near the flames, while the vampire woman lingered at the edge of the firelight, her ears attuned to the whispers of the night. The werewolf felt the same itch as the vampire, a primal urge to transform, to dive into the cool embrace of the night, to revel in its sounds and scents, to run, to push his muscles to their limit, to chase prey and sink his teeth into still warm flesh. But they remained by the fire. He had work to do, and she couldn't fly, not with hunters potentially on the prowl. A howl rose in the distance, answered by another from the opposite side. Leo relaxed. They were coming. Soon 2 groups of werewolves emerged from the shadows, one led by Alanya, known to humans as Grey, from the hunting commune, and the other by Clyde, the elder of the livestock village, known to humans as East. Leo wasted no time. He relayed the governor's demands. The news sparked anger, as he had hoped. They needed to remember they were nothing more than work dogs to the humans. He gave them a moment to vent before steering the discussion to preparations. Each group had been scouting the forest, pushing beyond the boundaries imposed by the humans. It was dangerous work. Humans had grown accustomed to wolves staying within their fenced zones, but reconnaissance was vital. At the same time, they'd been stashing supplies, food, hides, fabric, herbs. All of it hidden in caches meant to outlast the harsh winter. "We've found a few distant spots for camps," Ellen reported. "They're well hidden, untouched by humans." Moss spoke carefully with some local hunters at the town market. "Those areas are avoided. People fear the swamps and the diseases they bring. It'll be tricky in spring, but we're already hauling stones and timber there. We'll create hidden trails. Byrne and Drake know how. Their clan lands were always in the swamps. We've got more livestock this year than the governor knows about," Clyde rumbled, stroking his thick beard. "We'll salt, dry, and smoke a good portion of it. Your shares will be distributed soon. Before the first snow, we'll have everything stashed. We might even move some goats and sheep to the camps unnoticed. That'll ease the burden. With careful use, hunting and foraging, we can stretch this out for several months. Maybe longer. It's been a bountiful year, Leo acknowledged. We're also preparing your shares of grain and preserves. If most of the caches survive, we'll have enough for the first half year. Ellen, I trust the camps are as inaccessible as you claim. We must protect our cubs, our non-combatants, and the wisdom of the elders. His voice softened at the memory of his parents, who had welcomed even the harshest peace after so much loss. This new world had to survive for those who would inherit it. That's all well and good, but the estate is fortified, Ellen reminded him, her arms crossed. They can hold out much longer than we can. You promised a solution to that. Leo's grin widened, sharp and predatory. The smile of a wolf ready for a deadly strike. We'll solve this problem with plague and fire, the werewolf said, letting the group take in the weight of his words. For a long time now, I've been sending our she-wolves to serve in the governor's estates, to work for his people, cooking, cleaning their chambers, caring for their children. They're sweet, delicate, beautiful, and frail. They write me letters about how loved, valued, and even adored they are by the humans. And they wait quietly for the right moment. When we strike, the humans will lock themselves behind their walls. By then, these she-wolves will know enough to begin poisoning them, spreading panic with illnesses and weakness. Even earlier, they'll start luring rats into their granaries to spoil their provisions. If things go well, they'll help us get into the city while fire consumes their rooftops. Isn't that right, Silent? The vampire rose and stepped toward the wolf, lingering slightly behind him. He had already told her everything, and she had agreed to help if it meant reducing the humans' numbers and distracting them from hunting down the remnants of her vampire kin. Next, you'll tell me that this she-wolf can fly. Clyde chuckled into his beard, failing to catch her scent beneath her heavy cloak. His laughter died abruptly as the girl's cloak slid from her shoulders, revealing her bare form. Her hands began to change, lengthening into wings, her face taking on angular folds, her ears enlarging. Silken fur spread over her body, and the sharp cracking of her joints sent a shiver through the wolves gathered, their own instincts urging them toward transformation. A pureblood, a true one. Ellen drew her sword, ready to defend herself, and willing to help, to burn our enemies and theirs alike, Silent replied, her voice steady, her transformation complete. The cold crept in, freezing the earth and water alike. Each morning, frost coated the grass, and the cabins chilled to their cores, requiring ever more wood to heat. The werewolves still ventured into the forest, scouting trails and reinforcing hidden caches, but soon the snow would fall. Their dark tracks would become too visible, too suspicious. Even if they looked like wolf tracks, the size of a werewolf's paw was unmistakable. The governor sent his men with a cart and false condolences. 3 mutilated werewolf corpses lay haphazardly beneath a worn cloth. One hadn't even managed to fully transform before death. Leo listened with difficulty to their fabricated tale of an old stone building collapsing during repairs, how the wolves had supposedly caused the disaster themselves. Yet the governor, in his supposed mercy, bore them no grudge and would even forgive the fallen. But the gouges and slashes on the bodies bore no trace of stone or splinters. Instead, there was the sharp, acrid scent of violent death, lingering like a bitter reminder. The humans, knowing full well of the werewolves' keen sense of smell, still treated them like fools. For appearances, Leo helped the governor's workers bury the wolves in the human manner. They dug graves, wrapped the bodies in hides, covered them with soil, and marked them with stones bearing their nicknames. It didn't matter. In a few years, the bones would be exhumed and moved to the traditional burial site. That evening, Leo descended into the ravine, carrying a special ritual spade. He lit a fire within the burial chamber for light, and marked 3 new spots on the wall beside 9 already empty ones. He worked tirelessly until midnight, carving burial niches into the stone. At the base of each, he inscribed the true names of the fallen, names known only to their kind. By spring, he could retrieve the first 2 skeletons before the battles began. The rest would have to wait. Leo lit candles near Walter's niche and extinguished the fire. Smoke rose toward faint cracks in the ceiling. Sitting before the wall, he tried to steady himself. He needed patience. The winter would be long, filled with waiting. Mistakes would be unforgivable, and he needed to be strong, to keep others from faltering, to resist the growing fear that clutched at his heart. There was so much that could go wrong. Suddenly, Leo leapt to his feet. The fear wasn't his own, nor did it belong to Walter. His grandfather's spirit had always imbued him with courage, wisdom, and strength. But this was the cowardice of another. A foreign desire to surrender, to survive at any cost. It shouldn't be here. Its owner's bones still lay in a human grave as they had been taught. "Get out!" he snarled, barely restraining his transformation. "You don't belong here. These are wolves' graves. Only wolves' values have a place in my heart." His growl deepened, his claws flexing. "You're nothing but a dog scavenging scraps. Do you think I don't know? How you betrayed my grandfather like a mangy cur, just to keep him from telling me the truth you wanted hidden." The cold, more biting than winter's frost, tried to seize his heart. He felt 2 wolves wrestling within him, his father and his grandfather. No, 3 wolves. Himself. Only one would prevail, and it would be him. The winter came, dry and bitterly cold. It was as though nature herself sensed no crops would be sown in the coming spring, and took vengeance by freezing the winter wheat and perennials. Autumn's thaw, followed by sharp freezes, had encased the earth in an icy shell. Game wandered the forest starving, scraping for anything beneath the frost. Small deer had migrated out of the woods. Boars had raided the werewolves' vegetable plots, but soon became prey themselves. Moose held on, surviving on branches. Only the owls thrived, their prey forced to the surface, unable to scurry beneath the snow. Watching the owls, Leo prayed they wouldn't become the hunted come spring. Still, the sparse snow made training easier. The werewolves moved in small groups, honing their skills with weapons, learning to attack, defend, and fight as a unit. They practiced feeling the presence of their comrades, shoulder to shoulder, claw to claw. The most frightening thing for the humans? The werewolves were experimenting with partial transformations, melding the beast's body with the human's dexterous hands. Silent Annabelle proved invaluable. Small compared to the hulking males surrounding her during training, she shared the closely guarded secrets of the vampires. Like werewolves, they transformed. But while the wolves shifted fully and effortlessly, they hadn't realized they could merge the best of both forms. The terror and agility of the beast, combined with the human's precise grip. Silent demonstrated, guiding them through the sensations of transformation. Vampires and werewolves healed faster than humans, but Silent taught something deeper, how to focus their regenerative energy on specific injuries. It had taken her weeks to explain, but they eventually understood. They needed to alter the edges of their wounds, to sense the moment when the healing energy became unbearable, to direct their body's warmth and strength toward that point. It wasn't about small cuts. Those weren't worth the effort, but serious wounds that could drain life. They needed to neutralize those first. My ancestors would be horrified at what I'm teaching werewolves, Silent admitted, wrapping herself in the warmest fur they could find. Still, she shivered. Vampire's blood ran too cold. My grandfather might not have understood me either, Leo admitted after a pause, wearing only a wolfskin vest like the rest of the pack. The werewolves kept warm through movement. Now I understand why it was forbidden to teach your kind partial transformations and regeneration control, Annabelle replied. You pick it up so easily, even without precise anatomical knowledge. Winter is long. You'll have time to explain, Leo said. And after that? Do you understand that this is just one of dozens of human governors? Humans won't forgive you, or us. All that matters is starting. Once the fire of war ignites, it'll spread on its own. If we can take down one of them, reclaim our lands from at least one governor, it'll ease the burden. I'm sure of it. My kin will rally, and maybe yours will join us too. You think peace between us is possible? Well, we seem to get along just fine. Maybe it can work with others too, so long as we're not seen as property, Leo said with a wry smile. And the humans? To hell with them. Let them learn they're not our masters and be gone. The most important thing is finishing what my ancestors started, reclaiming our freedom. They entered the small town at a slow pace. Annabelle hurried ahead, but Leo adjusted his long strides to keep from outpacing her. There's something I don't understand, Annabelle ventured cautiously. Why don't you use the splitter? The what? Leo stopped in his tracks, startled. You have one. I can sense it in your house, she explained, puzzled. Leo quickened his steps, forcing Annabelle to jog after him. Once inside, he searched every corner until the vampire pointed out the exact spot. He tore up the floorboards, rummaging through debris and earth until he uncovered a bundle. The fabric crumbled in his hands, revealing a dirty sheath and a tarnished hilt. He discarded the sheath, exposing the weapon. Its silver engravings were dull with age, and the blade's edge looked strange. A small protrusion on the hilt caught his attention. When his thumb brushed it, a crackle of lightning illuminated the blade. This is a splitter, Annabelle explained, her voice even. A weapon forged by vampires to kill other vampires. It's incredibly durable, with a perfectly honed edge. Silver, of course, to inflict pain, and it carries a charge that paralyzes the body and sears the wound. These were given to loyal wolves to protect us. You didn't know? She asked, realizing the truth. The wolf's name should be engraved on the blade in silver. One of your ancestors must have been a bodyguard. Leo's thoughts raced chaotically. Could it have belonged to Walter? No, his grandfather had never been a loyal dog for the vampires. His work had been brutal. Fields, quarries, logging camps. Walter fought with axes and scythes, not silver blades. His grandmother had toiled beside him, as had Leo's mother's family and the vampire's estate. Leo grabbed a cloth and sat on the bench, painstakingly cleaning the tarnished blade. Annabelle climbed onto the stove to warm herself, peering over his shoulder with interest. Eventually, Leo uncovered the name inscribed in silver. Martin. The sword clattered to the floor with a disgruntled ring, a flash of lightning sparking from its blade. The bench tipped over from his sudden movement. Blood rushed to his head. His father had been... What did you say? This is a weapon for loyal vampire soldiers? He growled. Annabelle nodded cautiously from her corner. Though the name on the blade infuriated Leo, he came to terms with it. and began training with the weapon. It wouldn't do to discard a gift from fate, even one so tainted. Good weapons were never unnecessary. Winter continued its relentless march, the frost deepening and showing no sign of relenting. Anticipation grew with the cold. In the town, preparations were underway. Housewives flitted between homes, youths crafted something in secret, and the fragrant smoke of baking pies and brewing beer drifted through the air. "What's all this for?" Annabelle asked from atop a large sled piled high with kindling. "Burns hotter," Leo replied, dragging the sled with another wolf toward the town. Around them, wolf cubs, both in human and wolf form, darted and played, their joyful cries echoing in the frigid air. "But we need it to burn longer," Annabelle pointed out, confused. Leo simply smirked, his expression visible even from behind. She could almost hear his unspoken, "You'll find out in time." There was no sense pressing further, so she wrapped herself tighter in her coat and fur. Just days ago she had fed, yet still, the cold gnawed at her. The wolves, however, radiated heat like stoked furnaces, running through the freezing air with boundless energy. She could see their yellow-red warmth against the bluish snow. At the field beyond the town, bonfires were being constructed, piles of kindling growing steadily. "Are we roasting someone?" Annabelle asked, struggling with the hem of her long coat as she helped unload kindling. "That too," Grace replied with a sly grin. "You'll see soon enough." By evening, the bonfires were ready. The celebration began in several large homes. It was crowded, noisy, and thick with the scent of wolves. Surprisingly, Annabelle found herself enjoying it. The werewolves had grown accustomed to her presence, seating her at the head of the table next to Leo. They piled her plate with the best cuts and refilled her cup with strong homemade wine. "Now will you tell me what's going on?" she asked, relaxed and content from the warmth and drink. "It's a festival," Leo said, pouring her more hot wine. "Don't your kind celebrate the passing of winter? Tonight our ancestors come from the cloudy den to visit our homes, and here we are, well-fed and healthy, enduring the cold for their pleasure. Soon we'll go out to scare away the evil spirits that sometimes slip in with our ancestors, and hasten the arrival of spring with blazing bonfires. So don't get too comfortable," Leo said with a grin. Annabelle looked at him in surprise. Despite the slightly irritating wolf scent that seemed to cling to everything, she didn't want to step out into the cold, especially after such a hearty meal. Wolves were strange. But soon, everyone began to stir. "Here, Silent," Grace said, handing Annabelle a terrifying mask and a wolf pelt. "Don't even think about stepping outside without these. But tonight, just be a good little wolf." Grace leaned in and bumped her nose against Annabelle's forehead in a reassuringly wolfish gesture. Annabelle smiled and nodded submissively. She'd long given up trying to understand the peculiarities of wolves and simply followed their instructions. While she dressed, the vampire didn't notice when all the males disappeared. Only the females and the young remained in the house, dressing themselves. The most vulnerable, the newborns and pregnant, were in another cabin, celebrating separately and with no intention of venturing outside. Around their cabin, a protective mixture of salt, warding herbs, chamomile, and pine bark had been scattered. "Where are the others?" Annabelle asked Grace. "The scary wolves are already waiting for us by the bonfires," Grace replied slyly, donning her mask with its ferocious snarl, black eye sockets, and straw-like tufts sticking out in all directions. As soon as Annabelle finished dressing, Grace grabbed her wrist and pulled her out into the biting frost. The glow of the bonfires lit up one side of the town brightly. The moon shone high above in a sea of stars, its full face gleaming like polished silver. The cold nipped at Annabelle's cheeks, but the wine and food had left her feeling warm. They ran toward the bonfires as if chased by mischievous spirits tugging at their heels. Laughter and shrieks followed them, as the rest of the pack joined in the race. By the fires, the wolves were waiting, also masked and cloaked in pelts. Some showed off partial transformations, standing as half-beasts. The males greeted them with howls and beats of drums. In an instant, the celebration began. The werewolves growled, howled, sang, danced, and reveled with wild abandon. The wine clouded Annabelle's mind, making the world spin. The fires roared higher, and soon the young and strong wolves began leaping over the flames. Caught up in the frenzy, Annabelle followed suit. Her heart raced as fear mingled with exhilaration. She had done it, and a swell of pride filled her chest. And then the world turned upside down. At first, Annabelle thought the wine might have been spiked with something hallucinogenic. But among the heat of bodies and the glow of the bonfires, faint breezes brushed past her. Spirits. Real spirits. They appeared as ghostly wolves, celebrating alongside their kin, leaping through the flames and howling at the moon. Sometimes they tangled with something invisible to her. "What are you staring at?" Leo's quiet voice behind her sent shivers down her spine. Annabelle turned, pulling off her mask, and found herself nose to nose with him. He stood so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I can see them," she said, astonished. "Everyone can," he replied, stepping even closer, his wide, wolfish grin full of satisfaction. "Our spirits come to visit us. Do you know what you're supposed to do now?" "No," she admitted. The cold seemed to vanish, replaced by a fiery heat surging through her veins. "Run," he said, his smile unexpectedly warm. Annabelle turned and bolted. Leo gave chase, the pack of spirits running alongside him. Her mask and pelt slipped off into the snow, forgotten. The howls trailed her, but this wasn't a hunt. She wasn't prey. Trees blurred past as the spirit wolves ran beside her, sometimes darting ahead. Somehow she felt their encouragement, as if she truly belonged to the wolf pack. She leapt, and with a laugh, Leo tackled her into the snow. He nuzzled her cheek with his own, tickling her and sending laughter and squeals echoing into the night sky, as if the stars might tumble from their perches. Leo sat before Walter's remains. Martin's sword lay before him. His grandfather's spirit didn't object. In fact, it encouraged him. A weapon is the warrior's strength when it's wielded. It doesn't matter who owned it before. What matters is whose hands it's in now. Walter's voice seemed to echo. That blessing was enough. Leo stood, picking up the sword. "Peace isn't given. It's won," Leo said, repeating his grandfather's words as he extinguished the candles. Smoke swirled around the old werewolf's skull in agreement. Spring arrived dry, the meager snowfall barely dampening the ground before it evaporated. The winter crops had failed, and no one planted new seeds. When the governor arrived to inspect their progress, he found all 3 towns abandoned. Only the wind wandered the empty streets, licking at the scattered scraps of leftover belongings. There were no werewolves, no supplies, no tools, nothing. The dogs and hunters couldn't find a trail. The scent had dissipated, and the wolves had swept away every trace. "The governor's furious," Ellen said with a satisfied grin, her wolfish smile stretching wide. She and Annabelle had just returned from scouting. Leo smirked in response. "The more frantic he gets, the faster he'll burn himself out," he thought, recalling an old saying. "They've started stockpiling supplies." Kendra left a message. "The she-wolves are ready to begin." "Good work," Leo said, pulling Ellen into a brief embrace before leading her aside. How's it going with Annabelle? It's good having vampires on our side. She moves quietly and leaves no trace. When we mask her scent, it's like she doesn't exist at all. Don't worry, Big Wolf. She can sneak in and set the roofs ablaze. I'll teach her well. She might even make it out alive, Ellen promised. Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Leo nodded and turned to gather the leaders of the packs. The werewolves launched swift raids on the humans, forcing them to retreat into their fortress. The same wolves attacked each time, ensuring the governor would believe their numbers were small and hope his walls would hold. But in reality, for years, Ellen had skillfully hidden her hunters from census records. It was easy. An accident here, a bear attack there, a few hunters wandering into the swamps. The forest was a dangerous place, and humans believed her. The wolves had sent their call far beyond the forest, and by spring, lone wanderers and drifters began to gather, those who had long waited for this moment. Werewolves from other towns also joined them, weary of the oppression they had endured first under vampires and now under humans. They all sought the same thing, their own freedom. Spring was in full bloom, just like the homes behind the fortress walls. At night, while the wolves lured the defenders to the gates, Ellen and her hunters silently covered Annabelle's flight. She landed like a shadow on the governor's roof, setting fire to the bundles of kindling and tinder left behind by the she-wolves who served as maids. One house, then another and another. Arrows whistled through the air, but the vampire relentlessly spread the fire. Then she disappeared. What she had started was enough. The dry weather seemed to conspire in their favor. Dry air could make even damp wood burn. The wind picked up, fanning the flames into a roaring inferno. The city within the walls began to burn. Its people, weakened by illness and poisoning, a result of the sabotage orchestrated by the loyal she-wolves, were too exhausted to fight the blaze. Their attempts to contain it were futile, and the fire consumed everything in its path. Under the cover of the chaos, Ellen's team and the wolves assaulting the gates struck simultaneously from two sides. By dawn, the city had fallen. It was the first of many, should humans try to resist, a spark igniting the flames of their budding freedom. The governor and his closest followers were executed immediately, without trial. The common folk, as long as they didn't resist, were left unharmed. On the contrary, the wolves helped the wounded and offered the survivors a choice: to live peacefully on these lands or leave. Some chose to stay, their hatred for the governor outweighing their fear of the wolves. "Leo, Clyde, we have a problem with Calm, Cheryl, and Sylvia," one of the warriors reported, his face marred by a fresh claw mark from one of the she-wolves. The wolf was visibly upset. He had fought for them, after all. They're sheltering some of the governor's people. "Ellen?" Leo growled, and the three of them headed toward the she-wolves. The leader was exhausted, but rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. There was too much to oversee, too many decisions to make, and he needed to rein in those drunk on bloodlust. These were the most critical hours after the battle. How the wolves acted now would set the tone for the future. "Swear you'll let them live," Cheryl demanded the moment Leo arrived, her stance ready for a fight. Behind the she-wolves stood several human families. The adults shielded their children, whispering reassurances. A young man stood closer to Calm than to his family, his desperate gaze torn between his lover and his kin. He looked ready to defend them all. Different times, new alliances, Leo thought, while the voice of his grandfather grumbled disapprovingly in his mind. Leo restrained Alanya from lashing out at the perceived insubordination and nodded for Cheryl to continue. "They're good people," she said, her voice unwavering. They were against the governor and his cruelty, but couldn't act as openly as we did. They worked quietly, trying to make changes from within. I know because I helped them, and they helped me, even protected me from the governor's wrath. Take them to one of the intact buildings, Leo decided after a moment's thought. Less blood meant more potential allies, he reasoned. Let them stay there for now. I'll speak with them later. You can stay with them if you like. Clyde? I'll make sure no one touches them, Clyde agreed, his voice resolute. He wanted to believe, as Leo did, that not all humans were evil. Wolves weren't ferrets. They didn't kill more than was necessary. A murmur spread through the ruins. Vampire. Leo and Alanya quickly followed the sound to its source. Prisoners were being brought up from the governor's cellar. Most were wolves, exhausted, injured. There were a few humans, but they looked even worse, as though on the brink of death. Among them was a vampire leaning heavily on the shoulder of a wolf warrior. He gazed toward the nearly risen sun before his eyes met Leo's. Leo could tell by his eyes that he was old, though his appearance was youthful. Only the scars and fresh wounds marring his body betrayed the years of violence he had endured. "Martin? My loyal Martin?" the vampire said, his voice wavering with disbelief as he took a few unsteady steps toward Leo. But the hope in his eyes faded, replaced by pain. No, you're too young. But you have his sword. Are you his son? At least you survived. Who are you? How do you know him? Leo asked, struggling to keep the fear twisting his insides from showing. Over the past year, he had learned more about his family than he ever thought possible. Now, more questions only made his head pound. He didn't tell you? Of course he wouldn't. He was good at keeping secrets, the vampire said with a weary smile. Martin was my bodyguard, and Valerie, his wife, was a skilled craftswoman in our household. We supported the werewolf uprising against the other vampires. We came to Walter's aid. But the humans betrayed us all, his voice and gaze filled with a crushing sorrow. Martin gave me up to the humans to save what was left of his family, Valerie and their newborn son, and to secure their loyalty. I had to order him to do it. At least, someone. Leo's world reeled, but he had no time to process the vampire's words. A wolf's urgent howl cut through the air. He waved the vampire off, signaling they would talk later, and followed the call. The wolves were clearing debris from the ruins, and something painfully familiar caught his eye. He quickened his pace, dropping to his knees as he pulled a fragile body into his arms. "Hello, Leo," Annabelle said with a faint smile on her burned lips. Her hands were still partially transformed into wings, too weak to return to their original state. Without hesitation, Leo tore into his own wrist with his fangs and pressed it to her mouth. She didn't resist. Annabelle, we made it. We survived today. Leo stood at the edge of the abandoned city where the battle had raged just the day before. The remnants of the walls seemed fragile, as if a strong gust of wind might reduce them to dust. In his hands was the sword, heavy, its silver-etched hilt tarnished with age. The name Martin engraved on the blade weighed on his mind, pulling him back to a past where his father was still alive. Around him, his kin, the werewolves, completed their final preparations before leaving. Among them, Annabelle stood out, her pale skin and tangled hair stark against the robust, solid forms of the wolves. Ellen approached him, wiping blood from her hands with a rag. "She'll be a burden," she said bluntly, nodding toward the vampire. "Why are you dragging her along? We managed fine without her." Leo didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on Annabelle, who sat quietly at the edge of the street, trying to go unnoticed. She's one of us, he said at last, his voice sharp and firm. And if anyone doubts that, they can say it to my face. Ellen squeezed the rag in her hands, her knuckles cracking. Her displeasure was evident, but she held her tongue. Like many of the pack, she didn't trust vampires, and with good reason. Decades of escalating conflict between their kinds had left deep scars. Yet Leo knew that Annabelle was invaluable. She wasn't just teaching them to master partial transformations. She understood the enemy better than anyone else. "The city's been cleared," Clyde said as he approached. His thick beard was coated in ash and soot. "We took everything we could. Left the people who stayed untouched." "Good," Leo replied curtly. "We leave at dawn. The eastern marshes will be our new home." Clyde frowned. "The marshes? Are you sure?" "That place is nothing but mud, sickness, and death." Leo turned to him, his gaze cold and unyielding. "And here, we'll face walls that will collapse on us the moment the humans return. Want to stay? Be my guest. But don't expect us to come back for you." Clyde let out a heavy sigh but said nothing. He knew Leo was right. They couldn't remain here, even in an empty city. The humans would return. They always did. At dawn, the werewolves left the city. Their numbers were small, about 30 adults and a dozen cubs. Each carried their share of the spoils, weapons, food, fabrics. Annabelle walked near the center of the column, struggling to keep pace. Her steps were light, but her body betrayed her exhaustion. Leo noticed how she clutched her cloak tightly around herself, trying to stay warm. "Are you all right?" he asked, moving closer. "Yes," she answered shortly. He knew it was a lie. The vampire looked worn out from the battle. Her wounds were healing slowly, and fatigue had taken its toll. But she didn't complain, and Leo respected that. As the column moved deeper into the forest, Leo raised a hand, signaling them to stop. Ahead lay a narrow path through thick underbrush. Ellen approached, her eyes scanning the shadows with suspicion. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Leo nodded. He felt it too. The air was heavy, as if something unseen lurked among the trees. He gestured to the others, and the werewolves began to spread out, encircling the path and preparing for danger. "I'll go first," Leo said. He stepped forward, sword drawn. The path was tight, and branches snagged at his clothes. Ellen and Clyde followed closely behind while the rest held back. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of twigs underfoot. Suddenly Leo stopped. On the ground ahead were tracks, deep and clear, left by boots. Humans had passed through here recently. 3 of them, he said, studying the impressions. Moving quickly. Armed. "What do we do?" Ellen asked, drawing her knife. Leo glanced back at the column. The humans knew werewolves were here. If they let them go, they would return with reinforcements. But killing them risked drawing even more attention. "We can't take the chance," Leo said at last. "We eliminate them." Ellen nodded, understanding the necessity. They found the humans a few minutes later. The trio had set up camp in a small hollow, unaware they were being watched. Leo observed them from the shadows, taking note of their movements. 3 men, heavily armed, sat around a fire. Their hushed conversation was unintelligible, but their tense expressions revealed their purpose. They were searching for something. "We strike fast," Leo whispered to Ellen. No noise. They moved as one. The wolves melted into the shadows, their movements swift and silent. The humans didn't stand a chance. Ellen's strike felled the first man before he could react. The second barely had time to reach for his weapon before Clyde ended him. The third managed a strangled cry. But Leo's blade silenced him before the alarm could spread. When it was over, Leo wiped his sword clean on one of the dead men's jackets. "Burn the bodies," he ordered. "No traces." Ellen nodded, her expression focused. The werewolves worked quickly, leaving nothing but ash behind. "We're not staying here long," Leo said, watching the smoke rise. "Move faster." By evening, they reached the marshes. The ground grew soft and damp underfoot, and the air was thick with moisture. The werewolves began setting up camp, fortifying their temporary shelters. Leo watched them, feeling the tension in his shoulders slowly ease. The marshes were inhospitable, but they were safe, for now. Annabelle approached him, her eyes serious. "You knew they would be there," she said quietly. "Humans are always looking for us," Leo replied. "But what's next? Do you think we can survive here?" Leo looked at her. Her face was pale, but her gaze was steady. "This isn't a home," he said. "It's a temporary shelter. But we'll find a place where we can truly live. I promise." Annabelle nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. She knew this journey would be long and fraught with challenges. At dawn, the swamp camp came alive. The wolves worked in silence, fortifying temporary shelters and building platforms above the unstable ground. The low hum of the morning wilderness blended with the steady pounding of hammers and the snapping of branches. Leo stood in the camp's center, watching his kin move with purpose. They were accustomed to harsh conditions, but the swamp was demanding in ways they hadn't encountered before. It was a place where they couldn't linger long. Ellen approached, leaning on a long spear. Her expression was tense. "We can't stay here more than a few days," she said. "The swamp is good for hiding, but it's no place to live. How much time do we have?" Leo glanced toward the trees, lining the horizon. Their shadows stretched long and somber. "As long as it takes for the humans to find us," he replied. "We need to use this place to prepare and then move on." Ellen said nothing, though she knew he was right. Still, the young wolves were growing restless. Each of them craved vengeance, but war demanded patience and strategy. Annabelle sat at the camp's edge, observing the wolves. Her sharp gaze caught the smallest details, how they moved, what they said, the emotions they hid. She felt like an outsider among them, but she wasn't about to retreat. "You look like you're planning to betray us," Clyde muttered as he passed by, his voice gruff and his face grim. "If I wanted to betray you, I'd have done it long ago," she replied without looking away. Clyde scowled, but said nothing more. He knew she was right. Her presence remained a puzzle to him, but Leo trusted her, and that was enough to keep his suspicions in check. Brushing the dirt off her cloak, Annabelle stood and approached Leo. He was poring over a large map drawn on a piece of rough fabric pinned to a wooden board. Her attention was drawn to the charcoal markings scattered across it. "These are your plans?" she asked, stopping beside him. Leo nodded. "The swamp is temporary. We need to move north, closer to the mountains. We can establish ourselves there. And after that?" Her voice was calm but tinged with concern. "Do you plan to conquer lands, or simply defend your own?" Leo turned to face her, his eyes cold but weary. "We want to live. Humans forced us to become enemies, but we're not seeking war. We're seeking freedom." Annabelle nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting across the camp. "Then you'll need more than a swamp. You'll need strength." As the sun climbed higher, Leo called everyone to the camp's center. The wolves gathered, waiting for his words. The younger ones whispered among themselves, but the adults remained silent. "We can't stay here," Leo began, his voice firm and clear. "The swamp offers us cover, but it won't protect us. The humans know we're out here and they'll come. We need to be ready." "Where will we go?" one of the wolves asked, his voice rough but tinged with unease. "North," Leo replied. "To the mountains. We can build a new life there. But first we need to prepare. Here we'll train, learn, and grow stronger. We must be ready for any threat." The wolves nodded, though uncertainty lingered on their faces. Leo knew time wasn't on their side, but he had no choice. He had to lead them forward, even if the path was unclear. By evening, training had begun. Annabelle stood at the edge of the makeshift training grounds, watching as the young wolves sparred with one another. Their movements were fast but clumsy, relying on brute strength rather than skill. "You're wasting time," she said, approaching Leo. "They're not ready." "And what do you suggest?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the training. "I can teach them. Your bodies are strong, but you don't know how to use them properly. They need to learn control." Leo turned to her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Why do you want to help?" Annabelle met his gaze steadily. "Because I know what will happen if you lose. The humans won't stop. They'll destroy you, just as they tried to destroy us." Leo nodded slowly. "Fine. But if you fail, you'll be the first to pay the price." The training under Annabelle's guidance began the next day. She taught the werewolves not just to use their strength, but to feel it. At first, the young wolves eyed her with suspicion, but they soon began to understand her lessons. She showed them how to properly distribute their energy, how to use partial transformations to increase speed and agility. Wolves, who had once relied solely on their instincts, began to evolve. "You'll succeed if you continue," Leo said, observing the training. Annabelle nodded, her face focused. "This is just the beginning. They need time to master everything." "We don't have time," Leo said sharply. "The humans will come before we're ready." Annabelle looked at him. "Then we must strike first." Late that night, when the camp was silent and everyone else was asleep, Leo sat by the fire, holding Martin's sword. His thoughts were as heavy as the blade. He thought of the past, of his father, of all the unanswered questions that remained. Annabelle approached quietly, her footsteps almost inaudible. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Leo looked at her. "No, but I know we're on the edge. One wrong move, and everything will collapse." Annabelle sat down beside him. "Then make sure the move is the right one." Leo looked at her. Her words were simple but true. He knew she was right, and he knew he had to lead his kin to freedom no matter how difficult the path. The night brought silence, broken only by the sounds of the swamp, the occasional splash of water, the chirping of insects, and the creak of branches. Leo stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the thick darkness. Annabelle's words echoed in his mind. She was right. If they waited, the humans would come for them, and their chances of victory would vanish. The fire behind him flickered, casting shadows on the rough shelters and scattered stones. The young wolves were already asleep, while the older ones kept watch. Annabelle emerged from the darkness so quietly that Leo only noticed her when she stood beside him. "They're ready," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Your wolves are learning faster than I thought." "But it's still not enough. We can't wait," Leo replied. "The humans have already started moving." Ellen's scouts spotted their tracks at the southern edge of the swamp. "So you've decided?" she asked, her eyes glowing in the firelight. Leo nodded. "We have one chance. We'll attack their camp before they're ready." At dawn, the camp was bustling with activity. The wolves gathered weapons, checked their gear, and prepared for the long trek through the swamp. Ellen gave out final instructions while Clyde ensured no one lagged behind. Annabelle approached Leo, her expression serious. "If you want to win, you need more than strength," she said. "The humans expect straightforwardness. They know werewolves strike fast, relying on fury. If you give them what they expect, we'll lose." "What do you suggest?" Leo asked, gripping the sword's hilt tightly. "Exploit their weaknesses. They have supplies and provisions. Destroy those before the fight begins. Weaken them, then strike." Leo considered her words. The plan was risky but logical. He knew the humans outnumbered them, but lacked the same spirit. If they could weaken the enemy, their chances of victory would increase. "Fine," he finally said. "We'll do it your way." The werewolves began their march at dawn. Their path wound through narrow trails surrounded by thick mud and swamp water. They moved swiftly and silently, following Annabelle as she led them along routes scouted by the pack's trackers. Her vampire instincts helped her find the safest paths, and Leo realized how indispensable she had become. When the human camp came into view, the wolves halted. Leo raised his hand, signaling for silence. The enemy had set up camp on a small rise surrounded by sparse trees. A fire burned at the center, and humans gathered around it. Their weapons lay nearby, and the guards appeared relaxed. "They're not expecting us," Ellen whispered, stepping closer to Leo. "This is our chance." "Annabelle?" Leo said, turning to the vampire. "It's your time?" She nodded, her body beginning to transform. Her arms elongated, and her fingers sharpened into claws. Her eyes gleamed red as she melted into the shadows. Annabelle moved toward the camp faster than the humans could have imagined. She moved silently, her steps light and deliberate. She slipped into the tents where supplies were stored. Producing a small torch, she lit it and tossed it into one of the tents. The flames consumed the fabric within seconds, and soon the fire spread to the camp's center. The screams of humans shattered the silence. They rushed to extinguish the fire, unaware that the werewolves had already begun their attack. Leo led his wolves forward. They moved as one, their strikes swift and powerful. The humans hadn't even reached their weapons before the front lines were destroyed. Ellen and Clyde stayed close to Leo, coordinating the assault. Annabelle dove into the thick of the battle, her claws tearing through the enemies. She moved with grace, but each strike was deadly. The wolves and the vampire fought side by side as a single army. The battle didn't last long. Caught off guard, the humans couldn't mount a defense. When it was over, the camp lay in ruins and the enemy was annihilated. After the battle, Leo stood in the center of the desolate camp, leaning on his sword. His hands trembled, but he gripped the hilt tightly as if afraid to let go. The werewolves began gathering supplies, taking everything that could be useful. Annabelle approached him, her face exhausted, but her eyes filled with resolve. "This was just the beginning," she said. "The humans won't stop." "I know," Leo replied. "But now we have a chance. We've shown that we can fight back." Annabelle nodded. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, but now she believed they could endure it. Leo gathered everyone around the fire. His gaze swept over the wolves' faces, young and old, weary yet hopeful. "We've started a war," he said, "and we will finish it. Now we know we can fight. We will fight for our freedom, for our future." The werewolves answered him with a unanimous howl. Their voices echoed over the swamps, reaching the starry sky. It was their call, a call of those who would no longer be slaves. By nightfall, the werewolf camp had fallen silent again. Leo sat by the fire, holding his father's sword. His thoughts were filled with doubt, but he knew he had made the right choice. Annabelle sat down beside him. "What now?" she asked. "We move forward," he replied. "We'll find our place." Her eyes met his. "I'll stay with you," she said, "until the end." Leo nodded. He knew this end would only be the beginning of a new story. But for now they had taken the first step. And that was enough.